Dominic Ryan, who is student master of the province in Oxford, so responsible for the formation of those who are in their initial training after the novitiate. He also teaches a range of things in the studium. We were struggling to put it under a particular heading because it comes under all sorts of headings. So it would be great to hear Father Dominic bring together those thoughts in his introductory talk for our seminar, which is entitled Aquinas on Hope, so setting us off on a good Dominican track as we think about hope in the course of this weekend by telling us what the angelic doctor has to say. So, Dominic.
So thank you for having me. It's about 20 years since I was last at this seminar. I think I came to the first one at Hinsley Hall when we'd moved from London Coney, but I've not been back since then. So it's a pleasure to be back and see some familiar faces and some not so familiar. So thank you for having me. And about the title of our talk, I wasn't at all sure what I would talk about, and the two other principal speakers had such coherent plans for exchanging emails and quite insistent and kind of putting me under. I felt a certain amount of pressure. I'm sure not they weren't intending to do so. And I thought, goodness me, what can I talk about? Well, I can just say something about St. Thomas on hope and hope that will do the job, because that's pretty much all I can talk about. But there's plenty more to come after that, and I'm sure it'll be excellent. Now, that said, I want to ask you to start by just reflecting. I wonder how many of us present here this evening have seen the film The Shawshank Redemption. It's what's termed a sleeper hit in the film world. That's to say, it's a film which didn't actually do particularly well when it was first released in the cinema. Yet it's a film which subsequently, usually through the word of mouth, became quite popular, either when re-released in the cinema or when released on video and DVD, signs of my age, I suppose, or again, later still, when it was shown on television. Whatever accounts for the Shawshank Redemption success, it's become a popular film which is frequently praised for its portrayal of hope in the face of adversity. Now, the basic idea of the film is simple. It tells the story of how one prisoner who has been unjustly incarcerated forms friendships among his fellow prisoners, copes with the very harsh, unjust and corrupt prison regime before eventually escaping and beginning a new life. About 3/4 of the way through the film, however, after he has escaped, the main character, writes to his newly paroled friend and tells him that, "I hope this letter finds you well," and that hope is a good thing, which I suppose it is. But the key point for us, I think, is that the main character hopes that his friend will join him in the sunset and work with him on a common project. That, at least, is how I remember the film. But more pertinently to assessing my memory is that what I want to explore this evening are some questions surrounding this and similar examples. For example, if I hope that my friend will join me in a given project, is that actually a case of hope? Might this instead just be a case of the word hope being used as a synonym for the word desire, such that I hope my friend will join me is equivalent to I wish that my friend would join me. I want that my friend will join me. how might we decide which is the case? What is hope? What nuances might we employ in our analysis of hope? How might such an analysis affect our understanding of what counts as the seeds of hope? It's questions like this which I want to explore to some degree, and I will do so with the help of St. Thomas. That's a big surprise, I suppose, given my title. That said, what I would propose to do then is first outline a general account of hope taken from St. Thomas, get some idea of what the concept of hope, the kind of generic idea, we might say, of what hope is. Second, then, I'll look at what St. Thomas means when he speaks of hope as a passion of the soul. Third, then, I'll move on and I'll look at hope considered as a theological virtue. That's probably the most common sense of hope, the most famous sense there is of hope. Fourth, I'll move on from the theological virtue and just try and say a little bit about the same virtue when it's animated by charity. Fifth, and perhaps a little surprisingly from there, I'll turn from the supernatural order to the natural order and just say a few words about whether there's a sense of hope which applies to intellectual creatures at the level of nature. And then finally I'll return to our prisoners from the Shawshank Redemption and see if we have some ideas to answer the kinds of questions I raised at the beginning. So let's start then with a general account of hope in St. Thomas. In order to get a sense of what St. Thomas means by hope, we have to sit his account in a context. We have to acquire a rough sense of some of the distinctions he employs between being, activity, operative potencies, and objects. Let's take me as an example. Here I am. I'm actual. I have, in a certain sense, being. From where does my being come, though? Well, God, ultimately, but my being is mediated through my rational soul. Form gives being, St. Thomas tells us. My rational soul is my substantial form. Therefore, the being that I have is a consequence of my rational soul, or at least having that soul. Now, it's a full-time job being me. It really is. By which I don't just mean my personality as such, that I have to spend 24 hours a day just doing the things I do and possibly boring other people in the process. What I mean is that were I to stop being, were I to lose the being which my rational soul gives me, then I, for all my charm, wouldn't be at all. In effect, I wouldn't exist. Well, that might be a good thing, you think, but it wouldn't be so good for me. Thus, St. Thomas can quote with approval Aristotle's definition of the soul, that the soul is the first act, the actuality, of a natural, organised body. It's from Aristotle De Anima, St. Thomas's commentary on it. But as well as being, I also do stuff, and I'm affected by stuff. There's more to me than just my being. There are my activities as well. I eat, drink, talk, wish, think, see, desire, even hope. And I do plenty more things beside. However, given my activities come and go, they are intermittent, whilst the being which my soul imparts remains, or at least is stable, that is, I must still continue to be in order to engage in any activities at all. Nevertheless, we can distinguish my being from my activities and tie the soul's first act to my being and its second act to my activities. Now, given potency and act are correlatives, once we recognise that being and activity are different actualities, then we need to postulate different potencies in order to account for them. In the case of activities, we postulate powers or operative potencies. As real, operative potencies are actual in relation to the soul and the being it gives. They are powers of the soul. As potencies, however, operative potencies are in potential with regard to their corresponding activities. So operative potencies are real powers that the soul has, and their actualization gives rise to further activity. Since operative potencies are not actual and potential in the same respect, one need not be concerned about claiming that these potencies are both actual and potential. They are so in different ways. Furthermore, that the same capacity can both be actual and potential in different respects can be verified by considering the example of two putative French speakers, whom we might call Fred and Bill. Suppose Fred can't speak French at all, but Bill can. Clever Bill, you might think. At a given moment, however, neither Fred nor Bill is speaking French. Fred simply because he can't, but Bill because he can, but he isn't at that given moment. At that moment, then, both Bill and Fred have the potential to speak French, yet their reasons for not doing so differ. Fred because he can't, but Bill because he isn't. Therefore, their respective potentials for speaking French also differ. In virtue of being human, Fred could learn French. Fred, in contradistinction from an animal, a brute animal at least, has the ability to learn French. He has the capacity. However, Bill, who knows French, but isn't currently speaking it, also has a potential to do so, yet Bill's potential is a potential to exercise a capacity he already possesses. And that's very different from Fred's more remote potential. In Bill's case, his potential is actual with regard to his knowledge of French, but its potential with regard to its use. It is therefore both actual and potential, albeit in different respects. Hence, operative potencies are powers the soul possesses. They are real potentials whose actualization makes different activities possible. The next step then is to ask how many of them are there and how are they diversified. Well, if we take the second question first, we can say operative potencies are of their nature directed towards the production of action. However, potencies and their acts must be proportionate, therefore diversity of activity requires diversity of operative potencies. In effect, there's many different kinds of operative potencies as there are different kinds of activity. But what diversifies activity? Well, actions are directed towards their objects. Sight, for example, is directed towards common things, growth towards quantity, and so on. An action not directed towards an object would be an action without a final cause, an end. It would have no purpose. Yet someone, say Thomas, thinks every agent acts for an end. Hence actions are diversified by their objects because the object is the end of the action. Not every diversity of object brings about diversity of action, however. For instance, objects which are only accidentally different as objects, such as a white flower or a white bird, do not result in diversity of action, because as objects of sight, a white flower and a white bird is not formally distinct. Consequently, we can say that the diversity of nature of the object as such brings about diversity of action. Or we might say difference of formal object diversifies action. So different formal objects diversify actions, and different actions diversify operative potencies. As a result, there's as many operative potencies as there are formally different objects to which the activity of the soul is is directed. Now, St. Thomas goes on to identify several such operative potencies, but the most important of them for our concerns, at least insofar as we're interested in hope, is appetite. Appetite or desire takes goodness as its formal object. What does that mean? Well, St. Thomas tells us what he means by good in the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae. The good, he says, quoting Aristotle, is what all things desire. So good is not being used in the everyday sense to mean kind or generous, etc. It's not good here in a moral sense. Rather, the sense of good employed is a formal ontological sense. Desirability follows upon perfection. Things desire their perfection, their completion. So the goodness of a thing is its perfection. Appetitive powers, therefore, in desiring goodness, desire the perfection of their possessor. Strikingly, this ties in neatly to St. Thomas's view of God. Because God is the first cause, however, each thing is also an effect of God, and the perfection of an effect is a certain resemblance of its cause. In that case, because each thing is an effect of God, then each thing, in desiring its own perfection, desires a certain resemblance of its cause. God, and thus we, can call God good, indeed not just good, but the good which all things desire. It's not to say anything is, apart from ourselves, is conscious of desiring God. It does suggest, however, that this type of teleology is hardwired into St. Thomas's account of reality from the beginning. Now, if the act of desire takes goodness as its formal object, and diverse actions diversify operative potencies, then appetitive operative potencies will be diversified by the formal object of goodness. Now that has brought us at last to the very activity of hope itself. In his discussion of the passion of hope in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Secundae, question 40, article 1, St. Thomas gives us a precise account of hope, or at least the formal object of hope. First, he tells us it's a good. So the object of hope as an activity is good. Second, it's a good which is orientated towards the future. So it's a future good. Third, it's a difficult good to obtain. And fourth, nevertheless, despite being difficult, it's possible to obtain. So these four conditions, the object of hope is good, future, difficult, but possible, kind of go throughout the whole of Thomas's discussion of hope. They characterize what he means by hope. It's good, it's future, it's difficult to obtain, but nevertheless it's possible to obtain. Now, I'll just comment further on each condition. First, that hope takes goodness as its formal object tells us that hope in all its forms, whatever they may be, is a type of desire. Appetitive powers tend towards goodness. Hope pertains to that. Hope is a type of desire. But it's not synonymous with desire. It's a particular type of desire. Hope is a desire which is orientated to the future. I can only hope for that which I have not attained. It's something coming, so to speak. I can't hope for a good I enjoy presently. If I presently possess such a good, then my desire for that good, I may still have a desire, but that desire will not be hope. Furthermore, this desire for a future good is for some future good which is challenging and difficult to obtain. If this desire for some future good were easy to obtain, for example, if my desire is, to get a bus ticket to Liverpool, say, that wouldn't be hope, because all I have to do is go online or walk to the bus station. It's easy to get a ticket like that. Simple. That wouldn't be hope. So if I talked about hoping to get a bus ticket to Liverpool, I'd really be talking about just a simple desire to get such a ticket, because there's no great challenge in getting it. So the desire which hope is, and hope is a desire, but nevertheless it must be for something which is difficult to obtain. So it's good, it's orientated to the future, and it's difficult to obtain. Finally, the desire which hope is for a good which is orientated to the future, one which is challenging and difficult to obtain, but one which also is possible to obtain. Were the good in question impossible to obtain, a square circle, for example, then I couldn't hope for it. At best, I could desire it. But such a foolish desire would only lead to despair. Were I a smoker, however, conceivably I might hope to give up cigarettes, at least on the supposition that doing so would be difficult and doing so would be good. So central to this idea of hope as a desire is that the good one seeks, say giving up cigarettes, is nevertheless future orientated and difficult to obtain. That difficult to obtain is an integral part of hope. Giving up, I did give up cigarettes 30 years ago, and it was difficult. But you see, that idea, it's a hard thing to obtain. The good in question is difficult. So hope is a particular type of desire for a good which is future, challenging, and possible to obtain. We are, of course, free to use the word hope as a synonym for the word desire, but if we do so, then we are sacrificing the distinctive character of hope. For my part, I want to stick with the strict sense of hope and then consider how Thomas understands the passion of hope. It might seem a little strange to talk about hope as a passion. Think of passions as emotions, and well, that is what he's talking about here. The logic, however, which leads St. Thomas to talk about hope as a passion is compelling. To see how, think back a moment to when we said hope was a desire for a good. Granted, we made further qualifications to the concept of hope, and those qualifications are certainly important, but for the point I want to make now, we can set them aside for the moment. Now, on the supposition we do that, we can ask ourselves a question. If hope is a particular type of desire for the good, then how is it we are aware of a good in order to desire it? St. Thomas's answer is that desire logically presupposes cognition. In other words, one must first be aware of something in the different ways in which we can be aware of things before one can desire it. One doesn't just desire abstractly, one desires something. Logically speaking, desire presupposes cognition. Cognition is prior to desire. Since, therefore, St. Thomas distinguishes two types of condition, sense cognition and intellectual cognition, then given desire presupposes cognition, it follows that St. Thomas will also distinguish two types of desire, sense appetite and rational appetite. Moreover, since hope is a type of desire and there are two types of desire, then we could also suppose that there are two types of hope which correspond to these two types of desire. One of which is a desire centred on the sense appetite, where a sensible good is desired. The other which is a desire centred on the rational appetite, where a rational or intelligible good is desired. Now we'll pick up the idea of hope centred around the rational appetite a little later. For the moment I want to focus upon hope as a desire centred on the sense appetite. This is the type of hope which St. Thomas calls a passion. Now that since the passion of hope is a desire centred on the sense appetite, and given desire presupposes cognition, then the object of the passion of hope will be a sensible good, that is, one apprehended by the senses in some way. Furthermore, since sense cognition and appetite are common to both rational and non-rational animals, then interestingly both rational and non-rational animals can hope in this sense. Thus St. Thomas tells us in the Prima Secundae, question 40, article 3, the internal passions of animals can be gathered from their outward movements, from which it is clear that hope is in non-rational animals. For if a dog sees a hare or a hawk sees a bird too far off, it makes no movement towards it, as having no hope to catch it. Whereas if it be near, it makes a movement towards it, as being in hope of catching it. Now the dog isn't recognising the hare, as say a human being could. Rather, the dog is seeing a shape it's familiar with and close enough to engage with, and so doing it leaps forward in pursuit. There is no intellectual awareness in the dog of what's going on. Such a desire is for a sensible good, which is not present, that is attainable in the future. It's difficult to achieve. It's not as if the hare is going to surrender itself to the dog, but which good nevertheless is possible if the dog gets a move on. As such, the desire fulfills all our conditions, or at least all the conditions St. Thomas identifies as verifying the concept of hope, and thus St. Thomas will quite happily say this is hope, construed as a passion. Moreover, insofar as this type of hope is a passion, then like other passions, it will also be accompanied by some physiological response. Our hopeful dog's heart rate, for instance, might rise as it sights the thing we know to be a hare. Alternatively, our hopeful dog might even salivate. Who knows? Nevertheless, as a passion, we could suppose that hope would also produce a physiological response in addition to the movement of the sense appetite which initiates that passion. Interestingly, St. Thomas makes a further example in his sentence commentary. He says, animals are found to work for the sake of some future good they deem possible. For example, birds make a nest for the sake of raising their young, and they would not do anything for the sake of an end unless they considered that end as possible for them. There's no natural desire for impossible things. The same way it's clear one animal does not attack another unless from a hope of victory. Again, the good sort is a sensible good, which is orientated to the future, which is challenging and possible. It fulfills St. Thomas's account of hope. There's no claim, though, that the bird is aware of this intellectually. To say that rational and non-rational animals alike can hope isn't to say that rational animals are governed by their hope and other passions in the same way that non-rational animals are. A non-rational animal, for instance, doesn't have any control over its passion of hope, or indeed of any of its passions. It just hopes in the sense described, and as a consequence pursues its objective. A human being, on the other hand, who, in virtue of being human, enjoys intellectual knowledge, can overrule his or her passions, even hope. And a human being can choose to pursue other goods, regardless of whether those goods are sensible or intelligible. Fundamentally, a human being isn't ruled by their passions as a non-rational animal is, or at least if we're being properly and fully human, we're not being ruled by our passions. Now let's say something about hope as a theological virtue. If we recall the conditions which characterize hope, namely that it's a desire for a good which is orientated to the future, difficult to obtain, but nevertheless one which is possible to obtain, then we might ask ourselves what other kinds of good we might hope for, or hope might be a desire for. Up to now, we've considered sensible goods and the concomitant passion of hope which desires them. But if we switch to intelligible goods, those which the rational appetite desires, then we can ask what goods might thus be desired by hope. Well, the most important of these, without a doubt, is God. Here I mean God considered as God. Admittedly, that might sound trivial, but it's not in any way. God considered as God is a way of thinking about God distinct from the idea we talked about earlier, whereby each thing in desiring its perfection desires a certain resemblance of its cause, which cause ultimately is God. That kind of desire pertains to the natural order. Here we're talking about desiring God as such through the theological virtue of hope. In effect, hoping for God as such, not merely as a cause which possesses my perfection in a more eminent way, but as something towards which I'm tending. Might such hope be possible? Well, turn to the conditions which characterize hope and apply them to God considered as such. God as such is clearly good, the fullness of goodness. God is not currently present to my intellect and will. What I mean there is that I here now am not actually enjoying the beatific vision at this very moment. So in that sense, the good which God is orientated towards the future. Moreover, it's certainly no stretch of the imagination to say that the good which God is difficult to attain. Left to my own devices, I have no chance whatsoever of attaining this end. At the very least, I need God's help through grace, and even when I'm in a state of grace, I can still sin and fall aside from that grace. So there's no doubt this good which God is hard to attain. That box is definitely ticked. But is this good possible to obtain? Not under my own efforts, certainly, but fortunately with God's help, it is possible to attain this good. Well, how does that work? Well, St. Thomas tells us that the hope of which we speak now attains God by leaning on his help in order to attain the hoped for good. So it's God who makes it possible for us to attain this good. It's not something I can do under my own steam, but God makes it possible for us to attain God as such. No amount of hard work on my part will do the trick. It's not that I'm just lazy, it's just not something I can do, no matter how fighting fit I may or may not be. Fundamentally, this is about God moving us towards the end he desires for us. That end is God as such, which, dare I say it, hopefully we will all enjoy in the beatific vision in the fullness of time. Now, once we realise that God is moving us towards this good, provided we don't inhibit God's action on us, then inevitably it follows that we become confident in the pursuit of this good. So we realise God is the one doing the heavy lifting, so to speak, and then we become confident. We're not confident because of our own power, our own capacity. To do so would be presumptuous. We'd be thinking we had the means to attain God, which we do not. It's God who's doing the pushing, the heavy lifting, so to speak. Rather, the confidence we acquire is a confidence in God's power, a confidence that God's power will bring this about. In other words, we go about our daily business in the world animated by the influence of God on us and confident that through God's power God can bring me to that end. That brings confidence. And that confidence gives rise to expectation. It's not just I'm merely confident that this will happen. I start to expect this to happen when I'm in the appropriate state of grace. We now expect to attain this good, and that expectation qualifies the theological virtue of hope. Our hope for God is an expectation. We are confident that we will attain it unless we ourselves inhibit this process in some way. Notice here there's a kind of further issue, because once we realise God has the power to bring this about, we then run the risk of falling into the sin of despair, because what can happen, you can meet people who recognise God has the power to save, to orientate us towards this end, but who, for various reasons, don't believe that power will be applied to them. So one accepts the faith element, so to speak, but then rejects that God can make this happen for them. That's the sin of despair. And it is a very pastoral, it's a very sad thing when you encounter someone in that state. And it's unfortunately more common than one might have thought. Okay, once hopefully we're in this kind of happy spot of being in the state of hope, having confidence that God will bring us to our end, expecting it in a good sense, not on the basis of our own powers, but on the action of God in our lives, that gives rise to two further questions at least. First, what characteristic, we might ask, or combination of characteristics, is it that God possesses which gives rise to this hope? Certainly God is simple, as we know. Therefore, God is his goodness, God is God's power, God is God's omnipotence, and so on and so forth. In which case, when we ask this question, we're only speaking here about distinctions of reason. I'm not saying these characteristics are really distinct in God. But when we do so consider God, what characteristics are we concerned with? Well, we're confident in the attainment of this end. We're expecting to achieve it because God's omnipotence can bring it about. God has what it takes to bring this about. Fair enough, one might say. God is omnipotent, and that explains our confidence, our expectancy. But that's not the whole story. Yes, God's omnipotence means that it's impossible that we can achieve this end. But that alone doesn't mean I should be confident I will attain that end, much less expectant. To use an example, it's possible that I could run a mile in 4 minutes. You should laugh. This I know because it's been done. Not by me, I have to. But it has been done. It's a fact. It happened at Iffley Road, down the road from the Priory originally. So I know that this is doable by human beings, and I know there's lots of human beings out there who can do this. So it's possible in that sense. But I'm certainly not confident I could do that. I'd have to change my lifestyle significantly, go out running and so on and so forth. So that the fact that the power is there to do something, the fact that something is therefore possible in that way, isn't enough to give me confidence, because I know people have run 4-minute miles, but I'm by no means confident if I go out now into the grounds and attempt it, I will succeed. You probably have to call the ambulance. Explain to the prior, who's also called Dominic, what happened to the student master. Anyway, let's hope we avoid that. So my point is, omnipotence is part of the equation, but it's not the whole of the equation. Omnipotence is necessary, but more besides. What's required is some further assurance that God will employ his omnipotence to bring this end about. Not enough to have the power, you have to be convinced God's going to employ the power in that way. Fortunately, such assurance is to be found in God's mercy. God, through his mercy, promises all of us a path which leads to God, and God is faithful to his promises. The whole of sacred scripture attests to God's faithfulness. God keeps his word. It's us who turn away and do not. So God is faithful to his promises even when we are not. It's God's merciful omnipotence which justifies our confidence in and our expectation of this end. God's mercy sets the path out before us, and God's omnipotence is that which achieves the end in question. So it's a combination of God's mercy and God's omnipotence. Always remembering we're making distinctions of reason here. We're not saying mercy is one part of God, omnipotence is another part, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, our second question then, or second question that occurred to me as I was thinking about this, was given that we are confident we'll attain this end, that we expect to attain this end, expect in that good sense where we're putting our trust in God, his merciful omnipotence, given that we expect to attain this end, at least when we are in possession of the theological virtue of hope, what kind of certitude does this confidence and expectancy involve? I don't think the answer is as obvious as one might initially think, because even in a state of hope, we still retain the capacity to sin. We still commit mortal sin and turn away from God. I mean, I'm not obviously not advocating, I'm just as a fact, people do commit sin. And being in a state of hope, we might be less likely to sin, but people do still sin. So even in a state of hope, we have the capacity to sin. I can sin and turn away from God, and as a result lose the virtue of hope, and indeed any of the other theological virtues I possess. Therefore, the certitude of my hope, that confidence, cannot consist in the certitude that I will attain eternal life. I very much hope I will, but the certitude of my hope itself can't be for me in that way. If it were that my attainment of this goal was definite, then it just becomes a matter of time before I arrive at the destination. Such an account of certitude would imply that I couldn't sin, which is clearly false. I can sin, hopefully I won't, but I have the capacity, and ultimately it's only when I'm in the vision of God will that possibility be fully removed. Rather, the certitude of hope, I think, is one of order rather than inevitability. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about a plant, flowering at this time of year, as spring is coming after winter, it's going to bear fruit. That's what it's ordered to do. That's what we expect to happen. But it's perfectly conceivable we could have a dreadful frost, and suddenly the flowers that have begun to bloom die. In other words, they don't achieve their end, but a plant can't not be orientated towards its end of bearing fruit, regardless of what happens with weather. A Christian, however, in the possession of the theological virtue of hope, can't but be orientated towards God as the good that Christian desires. So when I'm in possession of the theological virtue of hope, I'm orientated towards God, and that's the certitude with which we're dealing. It's an order which is a consequence of the omnipotence and mercy of God. I'm pointed in the right way, so to speak, even if then at the same time I still have the capacity for sin and falling away from God, turning away from God. I retain that capacity. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about the theological virtue of hope considered as such, that is, independently of the theological virtues of faith and charity. Admittedly, the theological virtue of faith is logically presupposed to that of hope, insofar as cognition is logically prior to desire, but we haven't had much to say about the virtue of faith, and we certainly haven't had anything to say about charity. Now that's perfectly reasonable from a methodological perspective. We wanted to discuss hope, and that is what we did. But if we only understood hope in this way, we would miss something important about it. So let's say something more about hope. In virtue of the desire which hope is, I'm orientated towards God. So far, so good. But what's noticeable about this is that it's all about me. I'm orientated, I'm focused, I'm confident, I'm expecting. Me. So taken, the scope of hope doesn't extend beyond what counts as good for the subject doing the hoping. Me in this case. Hope is, in St. Thomas's language, a love of self. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se. We do need to love ourselves. It's important we want to be orientated towards the beatific vision. That matters. But there's more to it, because Christian life isn't just about me. There's a communal dimension to our Christian life. And if hope could extend to include that in some sense, then we might reasonably think the virtue of hope was somewhat impoverished. Fortunately, that's not the case, though. When we're in possession of charity, then we love as God loves. We don't just love each other insofar as the other can help me. On the contrary, we love the other as ourselves. In other words, we love the other person just as I love myself. They're just as important to me as I am to myself. We're starting to get a sense of how God sees us. So that's when we're in the virtue of charity. We love the other as ourselves. And that being the case, hope is then animated by charity. And not only do I love the other as myself, but I can hope for the good of the other in the same way that I do for myself. So I'm not just interested in me, I'm not just hoping for me. That's important, don't get me wrong, it's crucial. There's nothing more important to me than I get to the beatific vision. I hope God lets me in, please, it's massive. But I also hope you guys will get in as well. That matters. You see how it would be an impoverished sense of hope if it didn't extend to others. And charity makes the difference, because I'm not just thinking of you people as things to help me, but I'm trying to see you as God sees you and love you as God sees you, and God loves you just as much as God loves me. So when we have that grace of charity, that animates our hope so that we start to will the good for the other, desire the good for the other, in the same way that we desire the good for ourselves. Now we should also, so that's really about the theological virtue of hope, but it's also just worth wondering, can we suppose there's a kind of natural hope, not a passion, but is it reasonable to suppose that there's a sense of hope which applies to intellectual creatures at the level of nature, that we can hope for intelligible good other than God considers as such? I might hope for something that, I don't know, to do with my dinner or something. It wouldn't be a special virtue, because the object of my hope is something that I can attain through my own power. But I think in principle it's possible that there's a kind of natural sense of hope. But fundamentally, I would say the theological virtue is the most important. So now let's come back to our prisoners who we mentioned at the start of our discussion. Poor chap's escaped from prison. He's lurking in Mexico, hoping that his friend will join him. Well, it's an intelligible good, I think. It's not a passion. Insofar as Fred coming to join me in my business in Mexico, say, I suppose insofar as it contributes to my good, I can hope for that. I notice my friend won't necessarily hope for the same thing himself, so that hope may be thwarted. My friend may have other things he prefers to do than coming and do stuff to help me. If I'm in a charitable state, however, then I start hoping for the best for my friend, just in the same way I hope for the best for myself. So now I'm genuinely hoping that my friend attains a good. I think at that point, though, the good that I hope my friend will attain will be something that fundamentally fulfills him, not something smaller, so to speak. I'm now, say, hoping that my friend will find the fulfillment that's only going to be found in God, because at this stage, please God, my hope is animated by charity. So hope then for St. Thomas is a good, which is future orientated, which is difficult to obtain, but which is possible to obtain. And it's all these nuances which St. Thomas brings to the table and helps us realise just what it is God makes available to us, but the great dignity of the creatures that we are, that we're able to expound on what God has done for us, to reflect on it, and to come better to know the hope which he sets before us. So thank you very much. That's all.